The Manifestation of the Sons of God, Chapter 47, A Workshop for Seers. In this last section of the book, we want to talk about different practical ways to enhance, to develop the second sense that we've talked about, the ability to see and hear and to break more into a level of functioning in the realm of spirit. Let's read Hebrews 5, verse 14. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. Therefore, leaving the elementary teaching about the Christ, let us press on to maturity. A great problem that exists in elementary Christianity is the lack of leaving the basics and really entering into and breaking into a walk in the Spirit. For a very long time, the Lord has said, if you're going to walk in the Spirit with me, you're going to be some of the greatest mystics that have ever walked the face of the earth. And yet that word mystics can frighten people, and they can say, well, I don't want that, because they have a conditioned response that has been created by virtue of the satanic input that has gone before, which is so very common. You know, when you go back at the time of the early 1900s and the outpouring at Azusa Street and the speaking in tongues and just the whole level of coming alive for the believers at that point, it was preceded by and concurrently happening during the time of the Theosophical movement, which was the early stages of the New Age movement, where they were doing the seances and really moving in spiritualist type of things. Well, that created such a reproach that as God began to bring the restoration of the born-again experience and bringing his sons and daughters into a level of awareness, it was rejected heavily by the basic Christian world, because they would say that is of the devil, because it was preceded by the Theosophical movement that was in full swing by the time the experiences of Azusa Street began. And that has always been how it has unfolded. Satan's always had just a little bit of a heads up for some reason, or a sense of what God was going to do, and he would begin to bring the false early so that it would discredit the true when it began to open up for God's people, and then God's people would go through quite a change. Now, the positive side to that is that you had to walk by the Spirit. And if you were walking by the Spirit, it was okay. But those that walked after the soul, which was 99.9% of the majority, would have a problem with what God was doing. And that's continued to be the case, regardless. So that's just a little bit of a background, because what we're going to talk about is just basic principles, just basic concepts of how to reach in. What can we do? Is there anything more that we can do? And, you know, of course, waiting on the Lord, intercession, all of that is very important. It's priming the pump. And, but there are other things that we need to look at and just kind of open our awareness to these things. People have believed in God. Those who have believed in God have typically been afraid of a walk in the Spirit. The reproach that's been created over the past 100 years through this spiritualist movement has given it an aura of the occult. To some, a walk in the Spirit may even seem like an offshot of the occult. Yet if you're to walk in the deeper things of the Lord, like I said, you'll have to become a great mystic. And so you ask, well, what is a mystic? Simply one who's become aware and sensitive to the realm of spirit, to that realm just beyond sight, and who pursues after a deeper experience of knowing the Lord. Because, understand, as you break into the presence of the Lord, as you come into that level of abiding, everything begins to become visible to you. You don't get selective sight as you come into the spirit realm on a deeper level, as you come into the Father's house, an awareness of the Lord, an awareness of the Father. What that brings is an overall awareness of the spirit realm. You just don't have selective awareness. And so some may interpret that as being some great mystic, but it's really not that. It's just that you become and are becoming more and more aware of the Lord and of the Father, and of all the realm of spirit that exists within you, through you, and around you. Like we said before, we exist in a sea of spirit, a vast ocean of spirit. And that's why we've talked about, and we will talk about, the importance of visualizing. It's so important that we are able to visualize and keep visualizing and imagining to kind of get our mind out of this routine rut that keeps you earthbound. And all it takes is just a little imagination to break through the clouds that have seemed to separate the awareness that is actually available to us. If you're to move into the dominion of Christ and the administration of his authority, then God's sons must become mystics. You must be able to see and hear in the Spirit. The realm of spirit must be as real, if not more, than the natural plane that you lived on. And to do this, God's sons are constantly admonished to let go of the traditions that they've been brought up with. And this we've spoken of throughout the Word, letting go of the concepts, unlearning your learned belief systems. That's correct. Your learned belief systems. Because unbelief is learned. It's not just something that inherently you're born with. You learn it by virtue of your exposure and sojourn in this world, and the need to stay pliable and open and teachable. The world is evil has known what's coming to some extent and what God has planned to bring his people into, and as much as they've known, they've not understood, nor have they perceived to what extent the changes will be manifested within the sons. So they've, like we said, have brought forth the false manifestations before the time. And this has brought about a tremendous conditioning that God's people have had to let go of. They've had to let go of their fearfulness and the conditioning within their mind that would cause them to draw back from a deeper walk in the Spirit. Earlier in the introduction of the book, we briefly touched upon the history of the restoration of God's moving in the earth from the 1300s to the present day. And one thing that we must realize that in the days of the medieval world, there was a great time of darkness that existed. You call it the Dark Ages. And why do they call it the Dark Ages? Because the darkness was so prevalent, and the superstitious belief systems and just what was existing at that time with respect to a restriction upon the people that lived. Can you imagine the belief in the superstitions was no more restrictive than the limited religious thinking that exists in the world today? That's true. The superstitions that existed in the 1300s, 1400s, people lived with, that held power over them, is no less oppressive and restrictive than the religious thinking that exists in the world today. Back then it was obvious and blatant, but now it's much more subliminal and hidden. If there's one principle that we've addressed throughout this book, it's the fact that we're moving into another world, It's a world of spirit. And when you enter that world, nothing works the same, and nothing functions according to the principles of the natural plane. Now, I know we're kind of jumping ahead here, because for most, that level of reality has not become your basis point. Your basis point is still the natural world. And so you function within the principles that are in the natural world, but as you progressively break through deeper into the world of spirit, which is going to happen, then you're going to have to learn a whole new paradigm of how to function, because things don't work in the realm of spirit like they do in the natural plane. You almost have to have a different language. And so that's why it's been so imperative. Let go of your concepts, let go of your restrictions, your limitations, because the world that God is bringing the sons into will not be governed by the principles of the natural plane. And so it's a whole new world that must be learned. If you can imagine, going from one planet to another planet that is governed by a complete different gravity system, you've got to relearn the principles of that world. And it's the same thing. The more that we change and let go of the weights of this Adamic nature, the more sensitive we become. What may have had no effect on our awareness or spiritual vibration yesterday can be an anchor of 1,000 tons today. Because as you ascend, as I ascend, things that had no bearing all of a sudden become an anchor around your neck. That's why it's so important that we unlearn what we've learned within the scope of our belief system, what is possible, what is not, and we let God redefine our reality. The Lord Jesus Christ must have had a very interesting experience as he transitioned out of walking in the natural plane into the realm of spirit. Because, it says in the Word that Christ went through what we've gone through. So, when he was a young boy, and he went and stayed in the temple, and Joseph and Mary came and said, "What are you doing here?" And he was a young lad, and he says, "Well, don't you know I must be in my Father's house?" There was something that had already happened within the Lord at a young age of his connection to the Father. It was very deep, very tenable. And it continued to unfold, although we're not really, given any reference points within the Word to understand all of the things the Lord went through as he came out of, or grew from being a youth into, a full son manifested. But there was a process he went through, and that process all of God's sons are presently going through as well. We've come to an age where God, in the Spirit, is beginning to teach and impart to his sons the changes of this new day. Whether we realize it or not, the Lord is teaching. It really is the Scripture. You have no need of anyone to teach you, for the Spirit will teach you. And the Lord is teaching the sons in the Spirit. It's just that the sons aren't yet quite aware of what the Father's doing within them. God is bringing the keys that are opening the doors that have been closed. Those keys are a mystical experience that begins to unlock your mind, It's hard to understand it. It's hard to understand it when you say, God is, bringing the keys to open the door, to remove the seals. It's like in the book of Revelation, who can remove the seal off the book? Well, we've talked about this. You are the book. But how do you remove the seals that have been on the book? How do you open the door that's been locked within each of you and myself? The Lord, by the Spirit, must bring the key that uniquely unlocks you. It may not be the same key that will unlock me, but it will be unique to each of the sons as it unlocks you. And it's hard to explain what that experience is, because it is tied into the redemption and renewing of the mind. It is tied into that completely. But we're in the process of these things happening. God's removing the seals. God's putting the key in the door and opening one door after another within the sons, within you, within me. Everything that's happening, don't forget, it's not happening out there. Yes, there's judgment happening. There's a lot of things externally happening on the face of the earth, and there will be even more so, to the nth degree. Absolutely. But the real thing that God is doing, the greatest thing that God is doing on the face of the earth, is not the events that are coming to pass, and the Armageddon, and the armies of Satan, and the war, and, all of these things that are happening, and new heavens. Well, we won't go into the new heavens, new earth, because that has to do with you as well. Basically, what we're saying, the greatest thing God is doing is not external. It's within you. And we haven't realized that. That hasn't hit us. Really hit us. When you think, what is God doing? Lord, I know you're doing something. I sense it. I feel it. Changes are happening. Yeah, and you look in the news. Okay, I'm looking in the news. What's going to happen here? Things are turning upside down. So you'll see events. You'll see weather. You'll see things happening. But that's just leaves and branches of the real thing that God is doing, which is in each of God's sons, you and me, in real time, right now. Right now, if you could just stop for a second with me and just imagine, right now, not tomorrow, not in 2 seconds, right now. Do you ever get that feeling where all of a sudden something hits you and you're just like, you're so in the moment that it's hard to grasp it. But right now, God is doing something. And it's the greatest thing that God is doing on the face of the earth. And it's spoken of in the book of Joel. This great and mighty people that God is going to raise up. A fire proceeds before them, and, so on and so forth. The scriptures. And it says, there's never been anything like this before, nor shall there ever be again unto the years that will follow. Never again something so amazing that God is doing. And it's within his sons. That's where it's happening. It's not happening outside. It's not happening in another galaxy. It's not happening in creation, but creation will be affected by what's happening within the sons. But it's focused like a laser beam of light within you and me. And it's so difficult at times to grasp that, because we're still wrestling with the consciousness that is stuck in this earth plane. And you're running through a quagmire of mud. And it's difficult to get out of that at times, and to be aware of this magic that's happening within you. That is the greatest thing the Father has ever done. It's happening right now in God's sons and daughters. That is the mystery. Paul talks about in Ephesians, the mystery hidden from all ages. Christ in you, the hope of glory. Well, that all sounds good. We've talked about that. Christ in you, salutes of Christ in me, and whatever. But no, we're missing it. It's Christ in you. It's the Father in you, in me. Lord, help us. Lord, Father, help us to grasp the enormity of what you're doing within us. The enormity that goes beyond our ability to comprehend. That's how great this is, and how careful we have to walk before him, that we do not please him, and that we, to the best of our ability, stop tying his hands. And that we believe. We don't have to believe in who we are. We're not talking about that. We're talking about believing in what he is in us, in what's happening. I wish it didn't take so long to come to this place of recognizing this mystical thing that's happening in the face of the earth. And it's so hidden to the sons. Maybe not as hidden to the spirit world because they've seen it coming to some extent. But this is where we are. This is what we're travailing about. This is what we're groaning about. The Spirit groaning with words too deep to be uttered. That's what's happening. Your spirit is groaning with words too deep. You can't even hear. It's not even audible. It's not even on this frequency what's going out of your spirit as it travails and groans. Because of this thing that God is doing, this thing the Father's doing within the sons. And we've been missing it. Lord, help us to be aware of the magic that's happening within us, moment by moment, 24/7. Because something magical is happening within you right now. You're probably not aware of it. I'm not aware of it. But I know it's happening. Something deep is happening. So we'll continue this. But this is just a little introduction into this last chapter.